Nikki Halpin couldn't believe how well things were going. On January 8, 2004, the 32-year-old single mother was at a pizzeria in Safety Harbor, Florida, enjoying a night out with her boyfriend Chris and her sons, 7-year-old Drew and 9-year-old Max. Nikki had only been seeing Chris for a few months, and he hadn't had much interaction with her boys yet. But so far, tonight, he was nailing it. Chatting easily with Drew about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and also making sure to include Max too. When Nikki heard Max start to giggle over something Chris had said, Nikki suddenly felt this spark of happiness. She liked Chris, but until tonight, she really hadn't been convinced that their relationship had long-term potential. They'd met online, gone on a few dates, and it had been fine. Not exciting, but fine. But maybe that was okay. Chris was about her age, and he was an engineer with his life together. He checked the boxes, and maybe that was all she needed. Somebody who was solid, simple, and stable, who could make her boys laugh. I mean, that kind of relationship would certainly be a big change for Nikki. Her ex-husband, Donald, had been the opposite of Chris. He was an imposing prison guard and former boxer, built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and was almost twice her age. They met when Nikki was just 22, and Donald was 41. Her family had thought he was too old for her, but she had fallen in love with his rugged good looks and charm. But then life got complicated. Their eldest child, Max, was born with health issues, and the endless hospital bills and stress really strained their marriage. Donald started drinking more, their fights got worse and worse, and after nearly a decade together, it was just over. They separated in 2001 and finalized the divorce 2 years later. But for Nikki, she had actually been relieved. She had her freedom back. And so pretty quickly, she had struck up another relationship with a young, fit HVAC repairman named Dan Welch. Dan had seemed really exciting and charming, and for a while, Nikki had been convinced he was the one. But Dan didn't work out. He really just wanted to have fun, not get married. And so Nikki had ultimately dumped him. After Dan, Nikki had gone on plenty more dates, but Chris was really the first guy in a long time who felt like he could actually be something real. After dinner, Nikki and her sons drove Chris back home and dropped him off around 9:30 p.m. Less than 15 minutes later, they pulled into their own driveway, where the sight of the new house they'd just recently moved into made Nikki smile. It was much bigger and nicer than anywhere she'd lived with Donald, and the city of Safety Harbor felt exactly how she'd hoped. Quiet, warm, and safe. The perfect place to raise her kids. They went inside, and immediately the boys kicked off their shoes and headed in opposite directions. Drew went to the living room to finish his homework, while Max ran straight to his bedroom and powered on his video game console. As for Nikki, she walked down the hall to her office, and she turned on the family computer. The instant messenger app was still open from earlier, and she glanced at the text window, and she saw there was a new message from Chris. It said, "How'd you get home so fast?" Nikki frowned, not sure why he would ask that, but when her eyes moved up the chat window, she saw that a message had been sent from her account at 9:33 p.m., while she was still out driving. The message contained only 2 letters, HB. Now, keep in mind, this was 2004, so the instant messenger app could not have been on Nikki's phone. It could only be accessed from her computer, which meant that that message could have only been sent from right here, this physical location, by somebody other than her. Nikki, who now had goosebumps all over her body, just stared at the screen and then typed back to Chris, "I didn't write that." Nikki grabbed her home phone and called Chris, and when he answered and she explained what was going on, he sounded confused and worried about her. Nikki asked him to please stay on the line while she looked around her house. There could be an intruder. And so while clutching the phone and doing her best to stay calm, Nikki began going from room to room, checking to make sure they were empty. All the while, the only sound that filled the house were the beeps and chimes of Max's video game. At some point, after checking one of these rooms, Nikki went back into the hallway and was going towards the next room to check. However, before she got there, she heard something and turned around. And when she did, she froze. "15 minutes later, at approximately 9:50 p.m., Deputy Brad Ferguson of the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office was out on patrol when a dispatcher's voice came over the radio. A man had just called 911 in a panic. He said that he'd been on the phone with his girlfriend when she suddenly started screaming. The girlfriend's name was Nikki, and she was home with her 2 sons at 12 Clearview Drive in Safety Harbor. Deputy Ferguson switched on his siren and floored it towards the address. When he arrived, he knocked hard on the door. And to his surprise, a middle-aged man answered, looking very confused. Deputy Ferguson asked if someone named Nikki lived there, and the man said yes. The man called out Nikki's name, and a minute later, a teenage girl appeared. But to Ferguson, something just didn't feel right. Nothing about this scene matched the urgency or the information in that 911 call. Deputy Ferguson radioed dispatch and quickly realized there'd been a mistake. He was at the wrong house. The caller had given the wrong address, and it was just pure coincidence that there happened to be a Nikki there, too. The real location was 15 Clearview Drive, literally next door. This mistake meant Deputy Ferguson had lost precious minutes. He raced 30 feet over to the correct house, and the man from the wrong house followed right behind because he knew Nikki Halpin's family. They were neighbors. The lights were on inside of Nikki's home, but when they knocked, no one answered. The neighbors started shouting for Nikki and Drew and Max, and eventually 2 faces appeared in the window next to the front door. It was the boys, but there was no sign of Nikki. The boys recognized their neighbor and opened the door. Deputy Ferguson immediately noticed blood spatter on Max's t-shirt. When he asked where their mother was, Drew pointed down the hall. Ferguson walked into the house and headed in the direction the boy had pointed. And moments later, he stepped into the bedroom. And there was Nikki. She lay motionless on the bed. The blankets around her were soaked with blood, and there were deep wounds on the left side of her head. It was instantly clear this was a crime scene. Ferguson realized the attacker could still be inside, so he shouted for Nikki's neighbor to take the boys back to his home and lock the doors. After that, he radioed for backup and began clearing the house on his own. Gun drawn, he went room by room, closet by closet, until he was sure that whoever had done this was already gone. It frustrated Deputy Ferguson to think that the time he'd wasted going to the wrong house might have made all the difference. It might have given Nikki's attacker the chance to slip away. Minutes later, an ambulance arrived, followed by a fleet of police cars. Nikki was actually still breathing, but barely. So paramedics airlifted her to a trauma center, fighting to keep her alive the whole way. Meanwhile, the evidence retrieval crew got to work processing the crime scene. The house was littered with toys and sports equipment, which made searching for fingerprints or DNA even more time-consuming than usual, so the team knew they were in for a long night. Shortly after midnight, 2 detectives arrived to take over the investigation for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Their names were Ed Judy and Robert Snipes, and they were both seasoned investigators with over a decade of experience under their belts. Judy and Snipes spoke to the officers processing the scene, who told them that, as of right now, Nikki was still clinging to life at the hospital. But based on what they'd seen, the chances she'd survive were slim. Whoever had attacked her appeared to have hit her in the head and upper body over and over again with something very heavy and blunt. But so far, the evidence retrieval crew had not found whatever that weapon was. In fact, they hadn't found much of anything. There was no evidence of a break-in or signs that anything had been stolen. But Detective Judy was not surprised. The viciousness of the attack did not feel like a robbery, and he was already beginning to suspect that the motive might be personal. After checking out the crime scene, Judy and Snipes left the house and headed next door to speak with Drew and Max, who were still with the neighbor. They tried to talk to the 9-year-old, Max, but he was completely unresponsive. Nikki's neighbor explained that Max had medical issues and rarely spoke, and now he may be traumatized too, and so that left 7-year-old Drew. The detectives sat Drew down in the kitchen, and as gently as they could, they asked him to tell them what he saw. There was a long silence, and at first, the detectives weren't sure the boy would even answer them. But then, he started talking. Drew told the detectives that he had been in the living room doing math problems when he heard his mother scream. He looked up and he saw her running down the hall, and there was this large man in dark clothes with a black mask on, carrying something long and shiny, maybe a metal baseball bat. He said his mother screamed for him to go hide, and then she disappeared into the bedroom, and the masked man followed her inside. Drew was so scared he couldn't move, but he followed his mother's instructions and he hid until he heard the attacker leave. At that point, he snuck out of his hiding place and ran into the bedroom, where he found his mother, unconscious, and his brother Max cowering behind the bed. Drew took Max's hand and led him to the bathroom, where the brothers hid until they heard their neighbor's voice calling them from outside. When Drew finished telling the story, the detectives realized that the boy's ordeal was far worse than anyone realized. Max, the 9-year-old, had actually been in the bedroom with his mother while she was being attacked. By this point, it was nearing 2 a.m., and the boys were obviously exhausted. But Detective Judy had one more question. He asked Drew if he recognized the attacker. Now, Judy didn't expect much of an answer out of Drew, since the man had worn a mask. But to his surprise, Drew nodded and said yes. The boy looked right at Judy and said, "It was the man who knocks on the windows." On the drive back to the station, Detective Judy and Snipes talked over everything they'd learned, starting with Drew's final comment about the man who knocks on the windows. They had asked Drew what he meant, but the boy had not been able to explain beyond that. The detectives weren't sure if the man who knocks on the windows was a real clue or a garbled story from a deeply traumatized child. But whichever it was, they couldn't make sense of it right now. So they agreed to log the statement and come back to it later. For now, they decided to focus on the information from Drew that did sound reliable, and that was that the intruder was a man. This fact lined up both with their suspicions and with their training, which told them that whenever a woman is attacked, the culprit is usually an intimate partner. And so, in the detective's eyes, all the men in Nikki's life were now potential suspects. When the detectives got back to the station, Nikki's boyfriend, Chris, was waiting in an interview room to give a statement. Chris had been at his house talking to Nikki over the phone when he actually heard the attack. He was the one who actually made the 911 call. Logistically, it seemed hard to imagine how he could have done those two things if he had committed the attack himself. But at this point, Judy and Snipes weren't actually ruling anyone out. They knew Chris could have hired a hitman, for example, and there were a couple elements of Chris's story that raised questions. For example, they wanted to know why Chris gave dispatch the wrong address. The mix-up cost valuable time that possibly allowed Nikki's attacker to escape. And they also wanted to know, when Chris heard his girlfriend being attacked, why didn't he try to go to her house to check on her himself? He could have called 911 on the way from his cell phone. So the detectives sat down across from Chris and got right into it. Their first question, about the wrong address, Chris answered easily. He said he had been in a panic and simply mixed up the numbers. But the second question, about why he didn't do more to help Nikki, or at least go check on her, seemed to trip Chris up, and he kind of stumbled through a pretty confusing explanation. He said he had considered going to her house when he heard her scream on the phone, but he didn't because he was afraid that someone was waiting outside his own door and would attack him too if he tried to leave. To Judy and Snipes, this answer just seemed weird. There was no reason for Chris to think he would be targeted in some kind of coordinated two-pronged attack, and he hadn't mentioned it to the 911 dispatcher at all. It sounded like a pretty outlandish excuse. And so by the end of the interview, both Judy and Snipes were more skeptical of Chris than they had been when they walked in. But they still couldn't figure out a way for him to have been present for the attack while he was also home talking to Nikki on his landline phone. So despite having a few misgivings, they thanked Chris for his time and let him go. As soon as Chris was gone, Snipes called the hospital for an update on Nikki's status. It was now 3 a.m., 6 hours after the attack. Snipes was not expecting good news, so it came as a relief when the doctors told him that no, Nikki is actually still alive. Her vitals were stable, and it was looking more likely that she'd survive the night. Still, her doctors stressed that her condition was dire. After getting off the phone, Snipes shared the news with his partner, and then they got to work on their next task, contacting Nikki's family to fill them in and see if they knew anything useful. Unfortunately, a quick search told them that Nikki's parents and siblings were 1,300 miles away in Massachusetts, and this kind of news was just too serious to deliver over the phone. So they called up the nearest precinct and arranged for a local officer to drive out to her parents' place and talk to them in person. That local officer knocked on Nikki's parents' home right as the sun was coming up. Nikki's mother answered, looking confused and tired. When the officer told her about the attack on her daughter, she gasped and began crying. The officer reached out a hand, offering her support, but the mother gathered herself quickly and then looked up through her tears and told the officer she could guess who had done this: Nikki's ex-husband, Donald. To explain this, Nikki's mother told a story that stretched back a decade to 1994, in the early days of Nikki and Donald's marriage. That November, their oldest son Max was born with life-threatening complications. A buildup of fluid in his skull put too much pressure on his brain, and he only narrowly survived. Over the next few years, Max endured dozens of brain surgeries, and during one of those surgeries, a nurse accidentally gave him the wrong medication, and it nearly killed him. Nikki and Donald sued the hospital over the incident, kicking off a drawn-out and very expensive legal battle that created a lot of financial pressure on the family. These new money problems, along with Max's ongoing health issues, led to constant stress in their household, which eventually contributed to the collapse of Nikki and Donald's marriage. And then soon after their divorce was finalized, the hospital finally settled in the case, granting Max a trust fund of $1.5 million. And in the legal wrangling that followed, Nikki had become sole custodian of that fund, and Donald was shut out completely. He would never see a dime. This is why Nikki's mom thought Donald might have attacked her daughter. She believed that he simply harbored a grudge over the money. Detectives Judy and Snipes were already on their way to Donald's place when the Massachusetts officer who visited Nikki's mom called them to tell them about Donald's potential million-dollar motive. Now, Judy and Snipes already considered Donald a suspect simply because he was Nikki's ex-husband, but this new information shot him right to the top of their suspect list. They found Donald at home in his bachelor pad apartment, sitting down to coffee and the morning newspaper. When they told him that Nikki had been attacked last night and was in critical condition at the hospital, Donald looked at them in shock and then demanded to know where his kids were. The detectives calmly explained that the boys were perfectly safe, but they currently were in the custody of social services. They couldn't be released to Donald until the detectives were confident that he wasn't involved in the attack. Now, Judy and Snipes watched as Donald processed the fact that they were treating him like a suspect. He seemed surprised, and in a tight voice, he told them to come in and ask whatever they wanted. Inside, as Judy and Snipes launched into their questions, it quickly became clear that the divorce was a very sensitive topic for Donald, but not just because of that trust. He did say he did not think Nikki was managing the fund properly, but beyond that, he told the detectives that actually, he was still in love with Nikki. But this admission really only made Donald even more attractive as a suspect. Maybe, the detectives thought, he was jealous that Nikki was dating other people. So they asked Donald if he would come back to the station for a polygraph test, and he said yes. Detectives Judy and Snipes were hoping to use this polygraph test to press Donald about whether he really still loved Nikki or if his love had turned to anger. They wanted to try to catch him in a lie. But as soon as they got the machine up and running, Donald started passing question after question without so much as a blip. The detectives started to wonder if maybe they and Nikki's family had misjudged Donald. But then it happened. Judy asked Donald if he knew who hurt Nikki. Donald said no, and the machine registered a sharp rise in his heartbeat. This signified a possible lie. Snipes felt a rush of exhilaration, but he didn't mention anything about it until the test was done. When it was done, he confronted Donald about the question he'd failed. Donald took a long time to respond, and when he finally did, he said that he hadn't lied. He really didn't know who hurt Nikki. But if he was being totally transparent, he did suspect someone. He hadn't said anything until now because he didn't want to point fingers without any evidence. But if the detectives really wanted to know his opinion, Donald thought they should look into Dan Welch, the young, fit HVAC repairman Nikki dated after their separation. To both Judy and Snipes, Donald's accusation against Dan Welch just seemed like a desperate attempt to divert attention away from him. But then Donald explained why he suspected Dan, and it was surprisingly convincing. Donald said that Nikki actually used to vent to him all the time about Dan. At first, she'd been really into their relationship, but when she began talking about marriage, Dan apparently wasn't interested, so Nikki had dumped him. But after she dumped him, Donald said that Nikki had told him it was like a switch had flipped. Dan was devastated. He refused to accept that it was over and kept calling Nikki and begging her to take him back for months afterward. Eventually, Nikki turned to Donald for advice, and he told her to take out a restraining order. When Judy and Snipes finished their interview with Donald, they still weren't convinced he was innocent. However, they now had a second suspect, Dan Welch. The first thing Judy and Snipes did as they began digging into Dan was to search for that restraining order that Donald apparently had told Nikki to file. But there wasn't one. Not only had Nikki not taken out a restraining order against Dan, but nobody had. In fact, Dan had no criminal record of any kind. And the more Judy and Snipes thought about it, the more they realized that what Donald told them about Dan just didn't add up. Dan Welch had gotten himself dumped for not wanting to marry Nikki, while Donald fully admitted that he himself was still in love with her. And that was quite a motive. But before they could make any final judgments, they needed to talk to Dan. But that interview would have to wait. It was now late in the afternoon on the day after Nikki's attack. Detectives Judy and Snipes had been up for more than 24 hours working this case, and they were fading fast. Before they spoke to any more suspects, they needed to get some sleep. The pair reconvened the next morning at the station, and the first thing they did was call the hospital to check on Nikki. And unfortunately, the news was bad. She'd spent 36 hours on life support, she was unconscious, and showing no signs of brain activity. It was unlikely she was ever going to recover. This put the detectives in a somber mood as they headed out to talk to Nikki's ex-boyfriend, Dan. Dan lived in Clearwater, just a few miles away from Nikki's home in Safety Harbor. Judy and Snipes wanted to catch him off guard, so they didn't call ahead before they knocked on his door. When Dan answered, the detectives studied his face as they told him they were here to speak about Nikki. They deliberately did not tell him why, because they wanted to see if the mention of Nikki made him nervous, or angry, or emotional in any way. But Dan just stared at them, like he couldn't understand what they were saying. In fact, he was acting like he didn't even know who Nikki was. So when Dan just continued to look confused, the detectives repeated themselves, this time using Nikki's full name. And that's when a look of recognition passed over Dan's face. He quickly waved them inside and said he'd been confused because he always called Nikki Nicole. Dan said he had heard about the attack on the radio and had been expecting a visit. As they walked to his living room, Dan kept saying how he was happy to help the investigation. But to the detectives, he seemed almost too eager. Dan's upbeat demeanor felt forced, and Judy and Snipes could sense anxiety just beneath the surface. They had barely sat down when Dan had already offered to provide DNA samples and invited the detectives to search his apartment for evidence. The detectives told Dan that yes, they would love to do both of those things, but first, they just wanted to talk. They told him that they had heard his breakup with Nikki might have gotten a bit ugly, and so they wanted to hear his side of the story. If there was any truth to Donald's accusations about Dan harassing Nikki following the breakup, the detectives thought this question might trigger some sort of reaction. But Dan just sort of shrugged it off. He said he had gotten over Nicole a long time ago, and he was now seeing somebody else. Dan also had an alibi for the night of the attack. He said he had spent the evening working out with a buddy and then went home around 10 p.m., and then he called his girlfriend. Dan pulled up contact information for both of those people and gave it to Judy and Snipes. At this point, the detectives weren't sure what to think of Dan. They figured his alibi would check out, otherwise Dan would not have volunteered it. So maybe Dan's anxiety they were sensing was just regular anxiety. I mean, plenty of totally innocent people get nervous around cops and often kind of over-explain themselves like Dan was doing. It didn't necessarily mean he was hiding something. But just to be safe, Judy asked Dan if he'd be willing to come to the station to take a polygraph. And like Judy expected, Dan said yes. When they got back to the station, they set Dan up in a private room and hooked him up to the polygraph machine. Dan said he was ready, so Judy began asking questions, with Snipes watching the monitor for signs of emotional distress. And pretty much right away, Snipes saw the needle spike. That meant Dan was hiding something. According to the machine, he was lying. But as Judy asked another question and another, something weird began to happen. Every question, even baseline questions about what day of the week it was, the machine would mark Dan's response as a possible lie. And with these kinds of results, it was hard to know if Dan was actually lying or if he was just so anxious that basically anything he said was setting off the machine. The detectives both knew that even in the best cases, polygraph tests are not perfect. The fact that Dan was failing so badly definitely raised their suspicions of him, but it wasn't a reason to hold or charge him. So after asking him the remainder of the questions, which Dan basically failed entirely, they had no choice but to let him go. That evening, Judy and Snipes talked through the case, weighing their potential suspects. They had now spoken to the last 3 men in Nikki's life. First, there was Chris, Nikki's current boyfriend. His explanation about not rushing to help Nikki because he thought he might be in danger because there was somebody outside his door still struck them as extremely weird. But the fact that he had called 911 as the attack was ongoing made it hard to see him as the culprit. They still hadn't ruled him out completely, but he was admittedly less suspicious than their other 2 suspects. Next, there was Donald, Nikki's ex-husband. And of all 3 suspects, he had the strongest motive, since with Nikki out of the way, he would not only get custody of their kids, but also control of a $1 million trust. And the fact that he had pointed the finger at Dan, Nikki's ex-boyfriend, was also suspicious, especially since there was no criminal record of the problems Donald had told them about. That on its own was almost enough to convince them that Donald was their guy, he was guilty. Except that their third suspect, Dan, the ex-boyfriend, had failed every question on his polygraph test. All in all, the detectives agreed that it was still too early to draw any firm conclusions. Just 2 days had passed since the attack, and so far, the investigation had been moving at a breakneck pace. Judy and Snipes felt good about how much they'd learned already, but didn't want to miss an important clue by rushing things. They would continue interviewing Nikki's family and friends, while keeping a particularly close eye on Dan and Donald. Those 2 they were the most suspicious of, and they figured if one of them was guilty, hopefully they would slip up and do something to give themselves away. The next day was January 11th. 3 days had passed since the attack, and incredibly, Nikki was still clinging to life. However, that morning, her doctors told her family that she would never wake up. So, Nikki's family said their final goodbyes at the hospital, then doctors turned off the machines that were keeping her alive. Nikki died shortly afterwards. And so that meant that Judy and Snipes were now officially dealing with a homicide case. Also, Nikki's death started a ticking clock on the custody of her sons. Drew and Max were still in social services because Judy and Snipes considered their father, Donald, a suspect. But that couldn't continue indefinitely. If the detectives didn't charge Donald soon, the boys would be released into his care, and Donald would take control of Max's $1 million trust. Over the next few days, Judy and Snipes continued interviewing Nikki's friends and colleagues, but they didn't come up with much new information. The only interesting tidbit came from a friend of Nikki, and it didn't help the detectives narrow things down at all. This friend said she thought the killer could be Chris, who was Nikki's most recent boyfriend, and the one who had called 911 during the attack. This friend said that Chris was jealous, and the couple argued all the time. And so all this left Judy and Snipes in a tough spot. They had lots of suspicions, but no hard evidence against anyone. A week passed, then another, with no significant new leads, and the detectives started to worry that their case was about to go cold. On February 16th, just over a month after Nikki's death, an office assistant at the sheriff's department was transcribing audio files from the case as part of the standard bookkeeping process. The case was approaching a dead end, and she was responsible for filing everything away properly. This assistant had already processed the dozens of hours of police interviews with Donald, Dan, and Chris, and she was nearly done. The last file on her list was the actual 911 call Chris had made on the night of the attack, January 8th. The assistant didn't expect it to take long, but when she put on her headphones and hit play, she heard something on this call that made her jump out of her chair. She had to stop and rewind the tape, going back to the start over and over again, just to make sure she wasn't hearing things. The audio was garbled, and it was hard to tell what was actually going on, but after a few listens, she was sure. It was not her imagination. The sound she had heard was definitely there, just buried under multiple layers of distortion. So the assistant dashed down the hall to Detective Judy's office and played the file for him and Snipes. At first, the detectives couldn't understand what she was so excited about. But then the assistant adjusted the levels a bit and played the call again. This time, through the crackly static, Judy and Snipes heard what she was talking about. Just like that, they knew exactly who killed Nikki Halpert. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, interviews conducted throughout the investigation, and the recording of the 911 call, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Halpert on the night of January 8, 2004. The house at 15 Clearview Drive, Safety Harbor, was silent and empty when, at approximately 9:30 p.m., the killer rode up on a bike. They stashed their bike out of view beside the garage and then looked around quickly to make sure nobody was walking past. Then, satisfied they were alone, the killer lifted the garage door up maybe a foot or so and rolled underneath. Once the killer was inside, they began to rifle through their backpack. They pulled out a mask and put it on. Then they took out a heavy silver flashlight, so large that at a glance, it almost looked like a metal baseball bat. Then, with the flashlight in hand, the killer walked from the garage into the house itself. Within moments, the killer was creeping through the quiet house down the hall. They headed to Nikki's office, where they switched on the computer. When the screen lit up, the instant messenger app was already open, and Nikki's conversation with Chris was visible on the screen. Just then, the icon beside Chris's handle changed colors, indicating that he was now online. The killer thought for a moment, and then hit a couple of keys at random and hit enter. A few seconds later, a response came through from Chris. "How'd you get home so fast? You must have run every red light." As the killer read that, they smiled. Now, they knew Nikki was on her way home. Killer switched off the computer screen and walked into a different room and hid. A few minutes later, the killer heard the front door open, followed by the sounds of Drew and Max running happily into the house. The killer stayed where they were, thinking Nikki would soon pass by. But the wait took longer than they expected. And so as the minutes ticked by, the killer grew impatient. And so eventually they poked their head out of the room where they were hiding, and right then they heard Nikki talking to someone in the hall. It sounded like she was on the phone, and she was saying something about an intruder in the house. With a sudden pang of horror, the killer realized their mistake. Nikki must have gone into her office. She had seen the message and realized someone had sent it from her computer when she was still gone. There was no more time to wait. The killer sprinted into the hall, where Nikki turned around, saw them, and screamed. The sound filled the killer with a blinding rage, and they shouted right back at her, "Nicole, calm down!" But Nikki didn't calm down. She turned and ran. And as she passed by the living room, she shouted for Drew to hide, and then continued into the bedroom to try to help Max hide. But the killer chased after her and grabbed her and threw her onto the bed. She screamed and tried to fight them off, but the killer swung that heavy flashlight as hard as they could into her head and her shoulders and her neck over and over until she stopped moving. The killer completely ignored Max, the 9-year-old who was right next to the bed cowering, who had just watched this happen to his mother. The killer simply turned, dashed out of the room, taking the bloody flashlight with them. However, what the killer failed to notice was the phone lying on the bed beside Nikki's limp body. The line was still open, and on the other end, Chris was listening over speakerphone while he spoke to the police on his cell phone. And so with Chris's phones so close together, the audio from Nikki's room was picked up and recorded along the 911 call. It was very faint and heavily degraded, but with a little effort, the phrase, "Nicole, calm down," could be heard in the background. And this was the phrase that blew the investigation wide open. When the sheriff's department assistant had heard those words, she instantly recognized the killer's voice, since she'd just transcribed hours of interrogation videos with them. But it wasn't just the voice that gave the killer away. One word caught on that tape sealed the killer's fate. Every single person in her life called her Nikki. Every person except for one. Only Nikki's ex-boyfriend, Dan Welch, the HVAC guy, called her Nicole. It was his voice on the recording. His voice saying, "Nicole, calm down," right before he struck her with the flashlight in front of her own kids. It would turn out that Nikki's ex-husband, Donald, had been telling the truth when he said Dan was harassing Nikki. Ever since their breakup, Dan had been stalking Nikki, showing up at her house without warning and pounding on the windows while shouting for her to come out and talk. And this fact likely explains the strange way Nikki's son Drew had described his mother's killer. To a child, Dan was the man who knocks on the windows. Dan was indicted in January of 2006 and eventually pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison and will be eligible for parole in 2028. In the early morning hours of March 11th, 1989, 4 young men who were all in their 20s and all very close friends left their homes in East Texas and headed south. 9 hours later, they arrived in the beautiful resort town of South Padre Island, which is just off the coast of southern Texas. They were there to enjoy their spring break by sunning on the beach, drinking in bars, and meeting girls. When they finally arrived that night, they were so exhausted from the trip that they went right to bed. The next morning, when they got up, they went straight down to the beach and they had some drinks. And then by the afternoon, they were talking amongst themselves and they decided that for their first full night of being on vacation, they would kick things off with a bang and they would go into Mexico and party there. And so they piled into their car and they drove an hour southwest to Brownsville, Texas, which is a town that sits right on the border of Mexico. And when they got there, they parked their car and then walked right over the footbridge that crossed the Rio Grande River into Mexico. On the other side, in Mexico, they found themselves in the town of Matamoros, which is very popular amongst spring break goers for their bars and their clubs. And so the 4 friends got a quick bite to eat at a hamburger joint, and then they made their way into the bars and the clubs, and they danced and they drank for hours. And then at some point, they got tired and left the bar scene. They crossed over the footbridge back into the US and made their way back to their hotel in South Padre Island. The next morning, when they got up and they recovered from their hangover, they decided they had so much fun in Matamoros the night before that they had to go back. And so that night, they piled back into their car, they drove back down to Brownsville, Texas, they crossed over that footbridge into Mexico, and then all night they partied and danced and had a great time. And then at some point, the 4 decided it was time to leave, and so they left their bar and began walking towards the footbridge. But that night, it was so crowded in Matamoros that you could barely move a foot without bumping into someone. And so the foursome split into 2 separate pairs. And the lead pair, they made their way ahead and they stopped at the gift shop right at the foot of that bridge going back to the US side, and there they waited for the trail pair. The trail pair, which consisted of Mark Kilroy and Bill Huddleston, they weren't far behind, but they got sidetracked when Mark saw a girl standing next to a house that he had seen earlier in the night, and he just wanted to go up and talk to her and say bye to her. And so they go over to this girl, and while Mark is talking to her, Bill moves on ahead and goes down an alleyway to urinate, and then when he comes back out, Mark and this girl are not there. Bill assumed Mark must have just moved on the little ways up to the bridge where the other 2 friends were at the gift shop, and so after looking around for just a couple of seconds, Bill makes his way up to the bridge and he meets up with the other 2 friends. And when he gets there, he asks the other 2 friends, where's Mark? Did he come up here already? And they say, no, we haven't seen him. And so now the trio's a little bit concerned, but they're thinking, okay, he must be with this girl he had seen. And so they backtracked a little ways and they looked for Mark. They went back to where he had been talking to that girl, and again, he wasn't there. And so they decided, okay, he must have already crossed the bridge and made it to our car, and he's probably just waiting for us over there. And so the trio crosses over the bridge into the US side, they get to their car, and Mark's not there. And so at this point, they are pretty concerned about Mark, but they eventually convince themselves that he must have just left with this girl, and they probably are back at the hotel together. And so after a little while, the trio decides, let's just go back to the hotel, we're bound to find Mark. And so they drive all the way back to South Padre Island, they get to their hotel room and Mark's not there, but again, they tell themselves he's not here because he's probably with this girl in another room, and so they don't worry about him, they go to bed, but the next morning, when Mark still had not come back to the hotel room, they decide, you know what, something's wrong here, we have to tell police. And so they file a missing person report, but the police get so many of these about spring breakers who go missing in Matamoros that they don't really take them seriously at first, because typically the missing person will just show up 24 hours later with a horrible hangover and no memory of how they got back from Matamoros. And so the police were expecting this to happen with Mark, but after 24 hours, when Mark didn't show up with a bad hangover, they were convinced that something had happened to him, and American and Mexican police suspected foul play because Matamoros and the surrounding areas are not exactly safe for tourists, but they didn't have any leads, and so Mark's case languished. 3 weeks later, a drug smuggler drove through a police checkpoint without stopping just outside of Matamoros. And so the police pursued him, and this guy ultimately stopped at this secluded ranch up in the mountains. After the police arrested the smuggler, they noticed a ranch worker was standing nearby, and on a whim, they showed him a picture of Mark and said, "Hey, have you seen this guy?" And the worker, despite being scared and not really sure what to do, he said to police, "Yeah, I have seen him here. The smuggler and his friends, they brought him here in handcuffs." And then the worker turned around and pointed up the mountain towards the shack that was about 400 yards up the mountain, and he said that's where they took him. And so authorities began walking up the hillside towards the shack, and when they got about 100 yards away, they saw this big metal cauldron sitting on the front stoop of the shack. And then when they got about 50 yards away, they were hit with this horrible smell of death and decay. And then when they got right up in front of the shack and could see inside of this cauldron and inside of the shack itself, what they saw was so gruesome and horrible that even the most senior and grizzled responding officers were totally shaken up by it. Under intense questioning, the drug smuggler that had originally led police up to this secluded ranch and the shack admitted that he was a part of a gang and that his gang had taken Mark. 3 weeks earlier, while Bill was urinating in that alleyway, Mark spoke to that girl he wanted to see, and then she went off, and then Mark was left standing alone waiting for Bill to come back. And while he was waiting, a man on the street parked in a red truck yelled out to him to come over. He needed help or something. He lured him to the truck. And so Mark went over to the truck, and then right when he asked the man, what do you need? 2 men, one of which included this drug smuggler, jumped out from behind a building and tried to grab Mark and put him inside of this red truck. Mark was a very fit, big, athletic guy, and so he was able to fight the 2 men off and then took off running down the road. But he only made it about 2 blocks when another car full of gangsters showed up, cut him off, and then at gunpoint got him to come into the second vehicle. And so once he was restrained inside of this vehicle, they drove him out of the town of Matamoros onto some backcountry roads up into the mountains to this secluded ranch where they left him overnight in the car. The next morning, the gang members came back out and they wrapped duct tape around Mark's mouth and his whole face and his eyes. They just left a little slit around his nostrils so he could breathe. And then they pulled him out of the vehicle with his hands tied behind his back, and they walked him up the hill to that shack. This gang that had abducted Mark, that this drug smuggler was a part of, was more like a cult. And this cult was led by a man named Constanzo, who practiced a form of black magic called Palo. Constanzo would perform Palo rituals, which he claimed to his followers would make he and all of them invincible. These rituals, which took place in the shack up in the mountains, involved human sacrifice. Constanzo would tell his followers that these people who were going to be sacrificed, they didn't just need to die, they needed to die screaming. Because Constanzo believed the more agony he inflicted on his victims before they ultimately died and were sacrificed to the gods, the more power the gods would grant to he and his followers. And so the people who got kidnapped and marched up to that shack to be sacrificed were subjected to unspeakable atrocities, and Mark had been selected to be the next ritual sacrifice. After Mark was led out of the vehicle with his face all taped up, he was walked up to that shack where he spent several horrifying hours with Constanzo and his cronies, and then at some point Mark was killed when a machete was brought down on the back of his neck. Afterwards, Mark's brain was removed and placed into their sacred cauldron and boiled, and then Mark's legs were removed, and then a long wire was inserted into Mark's torso and fished around inside of him until they hooked it onto his spinal column, and then they buried his torso and his legs, and they left that wire protruding from his body up out of the dirt. There was basically a lead poking out of the ground, and the reason they did that was because later on, they could just pull on that wire and pull up Mark's bones and use his bones to make jewelry. Mark's body was one of 15 discovered in and around this shack. The total number of people that Constanzo and his cult ritualistically murdered is at least 16, but believed to be closer to 26. However, the police were not able to get the official number from Constanzo because Constanzo had his followers shoot and kill him before the police could get to him. 5 other cult members were ultimately convicted for their roles in the cult's murders, and they were each given a sentence of over 60 years in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Most Feared Girl in Mexico. The Sierra Madre Oriental is a major mountain range that starts on the southern border of Texas and Mexico and cuts 700 miles south through the northeastern section of Mexico. About halfway down this mountain range on the eastern face lies a series of caves. And situated below these caves at the foot of the mountains are several small villages that are very isolated, and they're populated primarily with illiterate poor farmers. One night back in May of 1963, a 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero, who lived in one of these small isolated villages, decided to go for a walk up in the mountains, and he wanted to go explore the different caves. Now, this was something he did fairly regularly because there was a local rumor that there was actually hidden treasure in these different caves. Now, it's unclear if Sebastian literally believed that or if that was just kind of an excuse to go have a look around himself. But regardless, he headed out of his house and he began walking up the mountain towards these caves. The entrance to these caves were a couple hundred feet up the mountainside, and then each of the various entrances, which ranged in size from fairly small to enormous, were spread out a couple of miles in each direction. So Sebastian starts walking up the mountain towards the first entrance he can see. It's dark outside, he's got no flashlight, he's just walking up, and as he's walking, he notices off to his right, fairly far away from where he was, there was light coming out of one of the cave entrances. And he had never recalled seeing light coming out of any of these caves. Nobody ever went in these caves, especially not at night. And so his interest was piqued, and he decided he would kind of abandon his original plan to just kind of look around near his village, and he would actually walk all the way over to that lit up cave and see what was going on. So he turned right and began kind of walking uphill at an angle in the direction of this lit up cave. And so as he's walking, he's getting farther and farther away from the village where he lives, and he's starting to hear sounds coming out of this lit up cave entrance. It sounds like a person potentially, either they're laughing or they're screaming. He doesn't really know. He's thinking, maybe someone's having a party inside one of these caves. He has no idea. But after he gets maybe 200 or 300 feet away from this entrance, he realizes it's definitely a person and they're definitely screaming. And it does not sound like they're screaming out of joy. It sounds like they're screaming because they're scared or they're in pain. And as he's getting closer and closer and closer to this cave, his anxiety is starting to ramp up because he's really starting to be frightened by what he's hearing. And he's starting to realize there's more than one person inside of this cave. In addition to the person that is screaming out, there also sounds to be a large contingent of other people that are either singing in unison or chanting in unison, but some group of people are doing something in unison while some other person is screaming out. And so he's really starting to get nervous about this cave, but he just can't help feeling curious about what was going on. And so he just continued walking until he was maybe 10 feet away from the entrance to this cave, and he plopped down behind a rock. And so he's not really sure if it's a good idea to look. He doesn't want to be spotted by whoever is in there. But finally, he kind of works up the courage. He takes a deep breath and he slips out from behind the rock and he goes right to the edge of this big opening, maybe 10 foot across opening. And he peeks his head right around the edge of the opening and he looks inside. And what he sees causes him to just freeze in terror. Then his survival instincts just kick in and he turns and he starts running down the mountain away from this cave. He has no idea if he's been spotted or not, but he's sensing that someone could be chasing him. And so he is just running as if his life depended on it. And he would not run back to his village. Instead, he would run nearly 10 miles to the nearest police station. And when he gets there, he busts through the front doors and he's totally hysterical. He's drenched in sweat and the police officers are totally caught off guard. And so they're trying to tell him to calm down. And so Sebastian finally would kind of compose himself, but then he just was not able to describe what he had seen inside of this cave. Whatever he had seen, he knew it was bad, but the words were just escaping him. And so the way he described it to police was he basically thought he saw vampires. And as soon as he began describing vampires to the police, they're thinking to themselves, okay, I don't know what's going on with this kid, but this just cannot be serious. And so they consoled him and kind of calmed him down and said, look, kid, I don't know what you're talking about. If there's any news that comes out of something happening in the cave that's bad, I'm sure we'll hear about it and we'll follow up. But for now, we're just going to bring you back to your village. And so at this, Sebastian was really frustrated and he was kind of pleading with the police like, no, you got to take me seriously. There's something bad happening in this cave. Someone could be hurt. Someone could be dying. I don't know, but you gotta go to this cave. You gotta go see what's going on. But the police at this point, they're just not really interested. And so they ultimately do just drive him back to his village. And so he goes back into his home. The police go back to their station and everyone just kind of goes to bed for the night. The next day, when Sebastian wakes up, he just can't shake what he saw inside of that cave. And so he would once again run back to the police station. And when he got there, he began pleading with the police like, you gotta go see what's inside of this cave. I'm telling you, there's something awful in there. And this time, one of the police officers, his name was Luis Martinez, he would say, okay, kid, bring me to this cave and I'll have a look around. And so Luis and Sebastian, who was very grateful, they left the police station, they hopped in a police car and they took off. And then, later on in the day, the other police officers, who were not really paying attention to this cave thing, they realized that Luis and the boy had not returned yet, and Luis had not checked in via his radio. And so at some point in the afternoon that day, the other officers began calling out to Luis. They began calling him on his radio and trying to figure out what's going on, but he wasn't responding. And so the police thought that was odd, but they thought, you know what, I'm sure he'll be back soon. There's got to be an explanation for this. But the rest of the day would go by without Luis reaching out to them, and he didn't return with the boy. And so by that evening, the other officers were genuinely concerned that, something bad had happened to their colleague. And so they tried calling Luis a few more times on the radio. It didn't work. And so the officers, they made their way over to Sebastian's village, and they found Sebastian's family, believing that, maybe the boy was back and he could give some insight into where Luis went. But when they talked to Sebastian's family, they would say, hey, he's not back yet either. And so both Sebastian and Luis at this point have not talked to anyone all day, and they are missing. And so the police at this point, they realized this is an emergency. They need to figure out where these two went. And so they were kind of understaffed. And so they contacted the Mexican army, and they explained, we're missing one of our colleagues. We're missing a child from this village. And so the Mexican army would actually send out a military unit to assist them in going and finding these two people. And so the unit, they show up later that night, and the police and the Mexican army, they head out to where this cave was. And when they saw what was inside the cave, it would shock the world. To understand what was found inside of this cave, we need to go back 6 months to December of 1962. That month, two brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, who made their living basically traveling around Mexico, stealing from people and swindling people, they decided they were going to pull off their biggest heist yet. They were going to rip off an entire town. Their plan was to go into a small, fairly isolated village that was populated primarily with poor and illiterate people, and they would go in there and they would convince the villagers that they, the brothers, were actually prophets of an exiled Incan god, and if these villagers did everything they said, they would make them rich. And so the village the brothers identified as their target was a place called La Yerba Buena, which was located right at the foot of the Sierra Madre Oriental, right below where that cave was that Luis and Sebastian went to investigate. And La Yerba Buena was exactly what the brothers were looking for. It was home to only about 20 families that were all very poor and illiterate, and they were very suggestible. And so right before the new year, the Hernandez brothers strolled into La Yerba Buena, and they put on this very dramatic show explaining how they were the prophets of the Incan god. And these two brothers, they were very charismatic and they were excellent salesmen. And so they really sold the lie. And these villagers, who were very vulnerable and cut off really from the rest of the world, they believed them. They thought this was their big break. They're going to be rich. We just have to do whatever they say. And so almost immediately, the villagers effectively became the Hernandez brothers' slaves. They would give them anything they wanted and do anything they wanted. But after a couple of months of this, some of the villagers started to be frustrated with the Hernandez brothers, the prophets, because it seemed like they were not really working towards making the villagers rich. Instead, it just seemed like they were horribly mistreating the villagers. And it just didn't feel like this was a relationship that was benefiting the villagers. And so when this sentiment began to kind of make its way around the 70-ish people who lived in La Yerba Buena, the brothers picked up on it, and they could have, at that point, just kind of abandoned their gig. At this point, they've robbed the town dry. There's nothing left for them to give to the brothers. But for whatever reason, the brothers decide instead to salvage their operation. And so the brothers, they leave the village and they go to a city that's relatively close by, and they recruit this young woman named Magdalena Solis. She was a prostitute, and they tell her, hey, we have this con we're doing in La Yerba Buena where we're pretending to be prophets of this Incan god, and they're starting not to believe our lie, and so we need you, if you're willing, to come with us and pretend to be an actual Incan goddess. And so when you show up, they'll know that we were serious, that we have a direct line to the Incan gods and goddesses, and they'll believe us again, and they'll fall back in line. And so Magdalena, she likes the idea of participating in this con, and so she agrees to do it in exchange for some money. And so she, along with the Hernandez brothers and Magdalena's brother, his name was Eliezer, and he functioned as her pimp, those four people, they went back to Yerba Buena, and when they got there, the Hernandez brothers snuck Magdalena past all the villagers up to that cave up in the mountains. And they put her in the back of the cave. They kind of hid her behind some rocks and they dressed her up in an Incan goddess costume. And then once she was in there, the brothers went back down to the village and they rounded all the villagers up and said, "Come on, let's go up to the cave. We have a special ceremony for you." And so the villagers made their way up to this cave, and once they were all inside, the Hernandez brothers used some basic magic tricks and created basically a smoke screen. Once they had this smoke screen kind of billowing in the back of the cave, they secretly signaled to Magdalena, who was behind the smoke screen, and she knew that was her cue, and she leapt through the smoke and she presented herself to the villagers for the first time, and she declared herself to be a reincarnated Incan goddess, and if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to kill you. And so the message she was sending to the villagers was so intense, they completely believed that this was an Incan goddess, and therefore this was not a ruse. The brothers were not lying to them. This was all very real. There's a real goddess in front of us. And so they immediately fell right back in line. The plan worked exactly as the brothers wanted it to. However, there was an element of their plan they could not possibly have accounted for, and that was what Magdalena did next. Even though Magdalena was fully aware that what she was getting herself into was an act, it was a con, it was not real. Despite that, as soon as she jumped through the smoke and was standing in front of the villagers for the first time and saw the looks on these people's faces as they stared up at her and she saw their reverence for her, it had this profound impact on her. This is a woman who's never had control in her life. She's been a prostitute since a young age, and here she is, the most powerful person in the room, and it's not even close. And it got to her head. And so when she left the cave that night, she literally believed she was a reincarnated Incan goddess. And she was not a merciful one. Within the first few days of her stay at La Yerba Buena, Magdalena used threats of violence on the villagers to completely take over the village. She very easily supplanted the Hernandez brothers at the top of the power structure. Now, the Hernandez brothers probably were quite surprised to see this happen because they were expecting Magdalena to play more of a prop role to keep them in power, not the other way around. But ultimately, they kind of just went along with it because through Magdalena's control over the villagers, they were able to continue to exploit the villagers, and so they were getting what they wanted out of this relationship. Within a few weeks of being in La Yerba Buena, Magdalena was not only abusing every villager in every horrible way imaginable, she also was becoming completely delusional. She convinced herself that in order to survive, she needed to start drinking blood. And so she demanded all the villagers provide her with blood. And so in fear of retribution, the villagers began slaughtering all of their farm animals and their own pets so Magdalena could drink their blood. For weeks and weeks and weeks, the horrible abuse Magdalena would dole out on the villagers would continue, and these blood rituals would continue. And then finally, sometime in April, 2 of the villagers decided, you know what, I've had enough. I don't believe Magdalena is actually an Incan goddess. I don't believe the Hernandez brothers are actually prophets. I think this is all a scam. And so they decided the way they would handle this is they were just going to flee the village. Now, somehow their plans to run away got out, and the Hernandez brothers found out about it, and they, in turn, told Magdalena about it, and when she heard the news, she immediately told everyone in the village to make their way up to the cave for a special ceremony. So all the villagers, including the 2 people that were planning on running away, they made their way up to the cave, and once everyone was inside, Magdalena walked to the front of the group and she pointed at the 2 dissenters, the 2 people that were planning on running, and she demanded that the rest of the villagers kill them. And on the spot, all of the other villagers jumped on top of the 2 dissenters and they lynched them. They beat them to death in the cave. And then after these 2 people have been killed, Magdalena orders their bodies be strung up on these 2 pikes she had set up in the back of the cave because she knew what she was going to be doing up in this cave. And so after these 2 bodies were strung up on these pikes, Magdalena grabs a chalice and she walks over to these 2 bodies and she presses the chalice up against their bodies where they're bleeding from, and she fills it up and then she drinks from the chalice. And at this point, everything changed. Suddenly, Magdalena understood that it wasn't good enough to just be drinking animal blood. That was not enough to keep her, a goddess, alive. She now could only consume human blood. And so for the next several weeks, periodically, Magdalena would order everyone in the village to go back up to the cave for a blood ritual, which they all knew what this entailed. This no longer had anything to do with animals. This was human blood rituals. She would order them up and they would have no idea who was going to be the sacrifice. And so all these people, they get inside this dark cave, and then Magdalena shows up and she stands in front of them, and after kind of looking them over, she identifies her next sacrifice, and out of fear, the other villagers, who were the friends and family of the victim, would launch themselves on top of the chosen sacrifice and lynch them in the cave. And then afterwards, their body would be strung up on one of the pikes, and Magdalena would walk over with her chalice, she would fill it with blood, and she would drink it. And so this would go on and on for several weeks. And one of the most distressing aspects of these human sacrifices is that as she did more and more and more of them, Magdalena got it in her head that beating the sacrifice to death before consuming their blood was spoiling the blood in some way. And so what she began doing was she would have the other villagers beat the sacrifice into submission, and then she would have the sacrifice strung up to one of the pikes while they were still alive, and then she would carve their heart out while they were alive, and then she would drink their blood. So in May of 1963, when Sebastian, the 14-year-old boy, when he poked his head around and looked into that cave, he watched one of these sacrifices having their heart cut out, and he didn't know what to make of it, and so he ran to the police, and then the next day, he and the police officer, Luis Martinez, they would go back to the cave, and Magdalena and her cult would spot them, capture them, and drag them both into the cave, and both of them would be ritualistically sacrificed. They would have their hearts cut out, and Magdalena would drink their blood. When the police and army arrived in La Yerba Buena, it was a ghost town because all of the villagers had been ordered up to the cave where they had barricaded themselves inside with weapons because Magdalena probably knew there was going to be a big police response because one of their officers has gone missing out here. They're bound to be found out. And so when the police and the army reached the cave, there's this big shootout with all of the villagers. And during the shootout, the majority of the villagers are killed. Also, the Hernandez brothers, they're also killed in this shootout. And then after the shootout stops, the police and the army would go into this cave and they would discover the pikes, the bloody pikes that are in the back of the cave with bits of human remains all over the ground. And then they would leave the cave and they would search the town and they would find the remains of Luis and Sebastian outside a particular shack. And then inside the shack was Magdalena and her brother Eliezer. They were still alive. They were trying to hide from the authorities, and so they would be arrested. It's believed Magdalena sacrificed and drank the blood of at least 15 of the villagers over a 6-week period. However, the only remains to be positively identified were Luis Martinez and Sebastian Guerrero. Ultimately, Magdalena and her brother Eliezer were sentenced to 50 years in prison, and all of the surviving villagers who participated in these sacrifices or who participated in the shootout with police and the army, they were given 30 years in prison. Amazingly, none of the villagers ever testified against Magdalena or her brother, despite the fact they were almost certainly offered reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. Clearly, they were more terrified of the Incan goddess than they were terrified of the prospect of 30 years in prison. Although the exact date of when this happened is not known, Magdalena would eventually die behind bars. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please put a metal fork in the 5-star review button's microwave, set it for 99 minutes, hit start, and then leave their house. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message.